Before we begin tonight's quiet journey into forgotten history, if my voice brings you even a little peace, you're welcome to subscribe. It helps me keep making these slow, gentle stories for you. And if you feel comfortable, leave a small comment too. It helps these gentle stories reach more tired souls. Close your eyes and let the noise of the modern world fade away. Imagine standing on the rugged cliffs overlooking the dark, churning waters of the Black Sea 2,000 years ago. The wind here carries the scent of pine and ancient earth. In this remote land, hidden behind mountains and mist, a boy is wandering through the forest, not to play, but to survive. He is learning the secrets of the earth, tasting the leaves that kill and the roots that heal. He is building a body that death cannot touch. Tonight, we journey back to the ancient kingdom of Pontus to walk alongside the man whom Rome feared more than any storm, the king who made poison his daily bread. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Take a deep breath in, and let it out slowly. Tonight, we are not here to solve problems or worry about tomorrow. We are here to travel back, far back, to a time when the world was vast, mysterious, and lit only by fire and starlight. We are going to a place where the mountains meet the dark sea, a place of mist and ancient stone. Let the noise of the modern world fade away as we drift toward the shadow of the Pontic Mountains, the land of the Black Sea. To understand the man, we must first understand the land that forged him. Imagine a map of the ancient world unfurling in your mind. To the west lies Rome, a republic of brick and marble, loud with the clamor of senators and legions. But we are looking east. We are looking at Anatolia, the great peninsula that bridges Europe and Asia. On the northern coast of this land, bordering the deep, churning waters of the Black Sea known to the ancients as the Pontus Euxinus, lies the kingdom of Pontus. It is the year 134 BC. The air here is different. It is heavy with the scent of pine resin, damp earth, and the salt spray of a sea that is notorious for its sudden storms and dark indigo depths. Pontus is a land of dramatic contrasts. Along the coast, the climate is mild, nurturing orchards of apples, pears, and cherries. Indeed, the very word cherry comes from Sarasis, a city on this coast. But turn your back to the sea, look inland, and you are met with a wall of rock. The Pontic Mountains rise up like the spine of a sleeping dragon, shielding the coast from the harsh, dry plateau of central Anatolia. These mountains are not gentle hills. They are jagged, formidable peaks often shrouded in a thick, lingering mist. The valleys between them are deep and green, filled with rushing rivers that cut through limestone gorges. In these forests, the trees grow thick and tall oaks, beeches, and ancient firs that block out the sun. It is a landscape of shadows and secrets, a place where a person could disappear and never be found again. This geography is crucial. It created a kingdom that was naturally fortified, a fortress built by nature itself. The people who lived here were hardy, accustomed to the steep slopes and the unpredictable weather. They were a mix of cultures, much like the landscape was a mix of sea and stone. On the coast, Greek colonies had thrived for centuries, bringing with them their temples, their philosophy, and their love of trade. Inland, the Persian influence remained strong, a legacy of the great Achaemenid Empire, with its fire temples and feudal lords ruling over vast estates. Pontus was the meeting point of East and West, a place where the logic of Greece met the mysticism of Persia. And it was here, in the shadow of these looming mountains, that the stage was set for the arrival of a king unlike any other. The city of Sinope. Let us float down from the mountain peaks and hover over the capital city, Sinope. It is situated on a small peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea like a clenched fist. It is a city of white stone and red-tiled roofs, surrounded by stout walls that have withstood the pounding of waves and the sieges of enemies for generations. The year is moving slowly. The seasons change with a predictable, comforting rhythm. In the harbor, merchant ships bob gently on the water. They are wide-hulled vessels, smelling of tar and wet wood, loaded with timber, dried fish, olive oil, and slaves. The sounds of the dock are rhythmic and low, the creak of ropes, the slap of water against the hulls. The distant murmur of sailors speaking a dozen different dialects. Walk through the streets of Sinope in your mind. The roads are paved with smooth stones, worn down by centuries of sandals and chariot wheels. To your left, a marketplace where merchants sell spices from the East: saffron, cinnamon, and pepper, their aromas mixing with the smell of roasting lamb. To your right, a gymnasium where young men train in the Greek fashion, their bodies glistening with oil as they wrestle in the sand. But dominating the city, sitting on the highest ground, is the royal palace. It is a sprawling complex, a blend of Hellenistic elegance and Persian grandeur. There are colonnades of marble that frame the view of the sea, and inner courtyards filled with fountains that trickle softly, day and night. The gardens are lush, planted with medicinal herbs and exotic flowers brought from distant lands. It is quiet here, away from the bustle of the port. The air is cool and still. Inside the palace, the walls are hung with rich tapestries depicting hunting scenes, lions, boars, and stags. The floors are covered in thick wool carpets that muffle the sound of footsteps. Servants move like ghosts, silent and efficient, lighting oil lamps as the sun begins to set, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. In this palace, a boy is born. His name is Mithridates, the comet and the bloodline. His birth was not an ordinary event. In the ancient world, the sky was a scroll upon which the gods wrote the future. And at the time of Mithridates' birth, and again at his accession to the throne, the historians tell us that a great comet blazed across the heavens. Imagine standing on a balcony of the palace, in Sinope at night. The sea below is a void of darkness, but above, the sky is alive. The Milky Way stretches like a river of milk, and there, burning brighter than any star, is the comet. It was said to be so bright that it outshone the moon, spanning a quarter of the sky. It lingered for 70 nights, a fiery sword hanging over the world. To the Roman observers in the West, it was an omen of disaster. To the priests in Pontus, it was a sign of greatness. They whispered that the boy born under this star was destined to rule the world. The boy's lineage was as heavy as the mountains behind him. He carried the blood of two of history's greatest conquerors. On his father's side, he claimed descent from Cyrus the Great and Darius, the kings of Persia. This gave him a divine right to rule over the East, to be the protector of the Asiatic people. On his mother's side, the lineage was traced back to Seleucus, one of the generals of Alexander the Great. This connected him to the West, to the legacy of Greece and Macedonia. He was the living bridge between two worlds. A child of the comet, but let us look at the child himself. He was not a delicate prince who stayed indoors. From a young age he was drawn to the outdoors, to the wildness of the Pontic landscape. He was larger than other children, stronger. He learned to ride a horse almost before he could walk. He learned to pull a bow, to throw a javelin, to drive a chariot along the perilous cliff-edge roads. He was also a scholar. Pontus was a land of many languages. Historians say there were 22 different nations within his kingdom, each with its own dialect. Mithridates learned them all. Imagine the young prince sitting in a quiet room of the palace, scroll in hand, his tutor's voice a low drone. He is learning Greek rhetoric, Persian history, and the secrets of the natural world. He is learning the names of plants, which ones heal, and which ones harm. The banquet of death, the atmosphere in the palace, however, was not one of peace. It was a place of smiling masks and hidden daggers. The current king, his father, Mithridates V, was a friend of Rome. He had sent ships and men to help Rome destroy her enemies, the Carthaginians. For his loyalty, Rome had given him land. But friendship with Rome was a dangerous game. It brought wealth, But it also brought debt and corruption. Let us move to a specific night in the year 120 BC. Banquet is being held in the Great Hall of Sinope. The room is warm, lit by hundreds of beeswax candles that give off a sweet, honeyed scent. The tables are laden with gold and silver platters. There is roasted peacock, wild boar from the mountains, fish from the Black Sea glazed in honey and vinegar. The wine flows freely, thick, sweet vintage from the vineyards of the coast, mixed with water in great craters. The king, Mithridates V, reclines on his couch. He is a large man, indulgent, perhaps a bit weary. The hall is filled with the murmur of conversation, the tinkling of lyres, the soft laughter of courtiers. But there is a tension underneath the festivity, a current of unease that runs through the room like a draft of cold air. The young Prince Mithridates, now a teenager, watches. He has keen eyes. He notices the glances exchanged between certain nobles. He notices the way his mother, Queen Laodice, sits rigid, her expression unreadable. The king lifts his goblet. He drinks. This moment, frozen in time, is the turning point of history. The poison was not immediate. It was likely a slow-acting toxin, perhaps arsenic or hemlock, masked by the strong flavor of the wine. As the hours passed, the king fell ill. The festivities stopped. The music died away. The guests were ushered out into the cool night air, whispering, looking back at the palace windows where the lights were being extinguished one by one. The king died in agony. And in the silence that followed his death, the reality of the situation settled upon the young prince like a heavy cloak. His father had been murdered. Not by Romans, not by invaders, but by his own court. By the people who smiled at him, who poured his wine. The suspicion fell heavily on his mother, Queen Laodice. She was a woman of ambition who preferred the regency, who perhaps favored her younger son, Mithridates' brother, who was more pliable, more easily controlled. The architecture of fear, following the funeral, the palace of Sinope changed. It was no longer a home. It was a cage. Imagine the young prince walking the corridors at night. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every servant offering a tray of food was a potential assassin. He began to notice the small changes. The guards who were loyal to his father were slowly replaced. His tutors were dismissed. His mother, the queen regent, took control of the seal of the state. She ruled in his name, but he was a prisoner in his own kingdom. The paranoia was not a madness. It was a survival mechanism. He realized that to eat was to risk death. To sleep was to risk never waking up. He saw the fate that awaited him. Accidents happened to young princes. A fall from a horse. A hunting mishap. A sudden fever. The geography of his safety shrank. The mountains that loomed over the city began to call to him. The wilderness, with its bears and wolves, seemed safer than the marble halls of Sinope. In the forest, the dangers were honest. A wolf growls before it bites. The cold wind does not lie. But in the palace, a smile could hide a blade, and a cup of wine could stop the heart. He began to spend more time in the stables, checking his own tack. He began to procure his own food, eating only what he could verify, simple fruits or dried meats. He watched his younger brother, Crestus, being coddled and praised by their mother. He saw the courtiers bowing to the queen, ignoring the rightful heir. The pressure was building. Like the subterranean gases in the volcanic regions of Anatolia, the pressure in the palace was reaching a breaking point. Mithridates knew he had to leave. He could not fight them yet. He was too young, too isolated. He needed to disappear. The escape to the wild. The decision was made silently. There was no grand announcement. One evening, under the cover of a moonless sky, a small group of riders slipped out of the city gates. The hooves of their horses were likely wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound against the cobblestones. They rode hard, away from the coast, away from the comforts of the Greek cities. They rode up into the foothills of the Pontic mountains, The air grew colder as they ascended. The smell of the sea faded, replaced by the scent of pine needles and damp moss. Imagine the transition. The velvet couches were replaced by the hard ground. The silk tunics were traded for rough wool and leather. The elaborate feasts were gone. Now they hunted for their supper. This was the beginning of his transformation. The boy who left Sinope was a prince. The man who would return years later would be something else entirely. He was entering the crucible. For 7 years he would live in the wilderness. Not just camping, but living as a part of the ecosystem. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place for more than a night, afraid that his mother's assassins were tracking him. He went deeper into the unknown valleys, places where the mist never fully lifted. He observed the animals. He saw how deer avoided certain plants. He saw how snakes used their venom. He began to experiment. This is where the legend of the Poison King truly begins. Not in a laboratory with glass vials, but on a mossy rock in the middle of a primeval forest, grinding roots with a stone. Testing tiny drops of sap on his own tongue, he learned the agony of the stomach cramp, the fire in the veins, the numbness of the lips. And he learned to survive it. He built a tolerance day by day, dose by dose. He was hardening his body, turning his blood into something that death could not easily claim. The mountains shielded him. The towering fir trees stood as his sentinels. The rushing rivers washed away his tracks. He became a ghost. A rumor whispered in the marketplaces of Sinope. Is he alive? The people would ask. Has the prince perished in the snow? But he was very much alive. He was growing. His shoulders broadened. His beard grew thick. His eyes, once full of the uncertainty of youth, became hard and focused. He was absorbing the strength of the mountains. He was becoming the mountain as the wind howled through the gorges of the Pontic Alps. Carrying the snow of winter, Mithridates stood firm. He was waiting. He was preparing. The throne was his, and he knew that one day he would descend from the high places like a storm, reclaiming what was stolen. But for now, there was only the forest. The sound of wind in the branches. The crackle of a small fire. The vast, indifferent silence of the ancient world. Let the image of the misty mountains fade. The story has begun, but the night is long. Rest your mind in the quiet of the Pontic wilderness. The dangerous king is sleeping, one eye open, watching the stars. Let the image of the stone palace fade completely now. Let the warmth of the hearths and the smell of roasted meats be replaced by a profound and ancient chill. We are leaving the world of men, the world of straight lines and paved roads. We are crossing a threshold into a place where time is not measured by water clocks or the changing of the guard, but by the slow creep of lichen across a rock face and the lifespan of a giant oak. The young prince. Mithridates was no longer merely traveling. He was vanishing. The journey away from Sinope was a gradual ascension into a harder reality. As he and his small band of loyal companions rode inland, the Black Sea, that great, comforting presence that defined his childhood, became a distant ribbon of dark blue on the horizon. And then it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the rising hills. The landscape of Pontus is deceptive. From the coast, the mountains look like a single imposing wall. But once you enter them, they reveal themselves to be a labyrinth. It is a world of deep, V-shaped valleys carved by rushing snow-melt rivers. The slopes are impossibly steep, covered in dense, primeval forests that have never known an axe. Imagine the feeling of the air changing. The humidity of the coast drops away. The air becomes thin, sharp, and metallic in the lungs. It smells intensely of pine resin, crushed juniper berries, and the damp, earthy odor of soil that sees little sunlight. The sounds change too. The rhythmic hush of the sea is replaced by the constant, roaring rush of water over stones in the valley floors. And the wind, which does not just blow here, but howls through the gorges like a living thing. Trapped between the peaks, the prince was entering a bastion of nature that was indifferent to his royal blood. Here, a crown meant nothing to a brown bear foraging for grubs. A title offered no protection against a sudden blizzard. The wilderness was a grand, neutral equalizer. The first winter, the first year was a lesson in humility, taught by the unforgiving seasons of Anatolia. The summers in these high altitudes are short and deceptive, warm during the day but dropping to freezing as soon as the sun slips behind the peaks. But it is the winter that truly tests the soul. When snow comes to the Pontic Alps, it does not come gently. It buries the world. The passes become blocked, cutting off all retreat to the lowlands. The trees, heavily laden with white powder, bow low, creating a claustrophobic canopy of white and dark green. Imagine the young prince in this frozen silence. He who had slept on beds of imported Egyptian cotton, now slept wrapped in rough woolen blankets and bear hides, huddled close to a sputtering fire that battled constantly against the damp wood. The cold was a physical antagonist. It gnawed at the extremities. It seeped into the bones. He learned the specific, aching numbness of frostbite, and the agonizing tingle as feeling returned near the fire. Food was no longer a given. It was a daily puzzle to be solved. The palace cooks were gone. Now his stomach was ruled by the migration patterns of the ibex and the availability of winter berries buried under the snow. He learned the gnawing emptiness of true hunger, not the appetite between banquets, but the deep, primal need for sustenance that sharpens the senses and dims the higher functions of the mind. There were days when they ate nothing but boiled bark and lichens scraped from rocks, which tasted of dust and bitterness. There were other days, days of triumph, when they managed to snare a mountain hare or bring down a wild goat with an arrow. The taste of fresh meat, roasted over an open flame, smoky and rich, became a luxury greater than any spiced dish served on gold platters in Sinope. The language of the forest slowly, perceptibly, the prince began to shed the soft skin of civilization. The fear that had driven him from the city, the paranoia of poisoned cups and whispering assassins, began to transmute into a different kind of awareness. In the palace, you watch people's eyes to know their intent. In the wilderness, you watch everything else. Mithridates learned to read the landscape as he once read Greek scrolls. He learned that a sudden silence among the birds meant a predator was nearby. He learned that the direction the moss grew thicker on the trees indicated the prevailing winds and the north. He learned to distinguish the tracks in the mud near a riverbank, the heavy, flat print of a bear, the delicate, cloven hoof of a deer, the padded, deadly paw of a lynx. He spent hours, sometimes entire days, in absolute stillness. Imagine him crouched in the underbrush, camouflaged by mud smeared on his face and arms, waiting for game. To hunt successfully with a bow in dense forest requires a patience that borders on a meditative state. You must become part of the background. You must slow your breathing until it matches the rhythm of the wind. In these long periods of quiet, his mind changed. The chaotic anxieties of court life faded. The complex political maneuvering that had seemed so important in the capital now seemed trivial compared to the immediate reality of survival. The wilderness demands presence. You cannot worry about tomorrow when you are tracking a boar today. He began to understand the animals he lived among. He saw the brutal efficiency of the wolf pack working together to isolate a weak ibex. He admired the immense, solitary strength of the Anatolian leopard, a creature that moved like liquid shadow through the rocks. He realized that in nature, there is no cruelty, only necessity. The lion does not hate the gazelle. It simply needs to eat. This realization was a profound comfort. The threats in the wild were honest. A thunderstorm does not pretend to be your friend before it strikes you with lightning. A viper rattles its tail before it bites. Compared to the smiling treachery of his mother's court, the dangers of the mountains felt clean and straightforward. The forging of the body, 7 years, is a long time in the life of a young man. It is the span between boyhood and full maturity. The physical transformation of Mithridates was absolute. The soft layers of palace living burned away. He grew taller, his frame filling out with lean, hard muscle forged by endless climbing and hauling. His hands, once accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a goblet or a stylus, became calloused and rough, scarred by thorns and bowstrings. His skin, once pale from indoor living, became weathered by the sun and wind. Tanned to the color of oiled walnut, his beard grew thick and untrimmed, protecting his face from the cold. His hair grew long, often tied back with a simple leather thong. If a courtier from Sinope had stumbled upon this man in the woods, draped in animal skins, carrying a heavy hunting spear, they would not have recognized their prince. They would have seen a barbarian, a wild man of the hills. He developed a stamina that became legendary. Historians later wrote that he could outrun a deer and ride a horse for 100 miles in a single day without tiring. He could sleep on the bare ground in the rain and wake rested. He became immune to the minor ailments that plagued civilized men, the colds, the fevers, the aches. His body had become a hardened instrument of survival, but it was not just strength. It was agility. He learned to move through the dense forest without making a sound, stepping over dry twigs instead of snapping them. He could scale cliff faces that looked sheer, finding fingerholds in the smallest cracks of the limestone. He rode the small, sturdy horses of the steppes, creatures as hardy as he was, guiding them along narrow, mountain paths where a single misstep meant a fall into the abyss. The companions of the fire, he was alone in his mind. But not entirely alone in body. He had fled with a small retinue, perhaps a dozen men who had remained loyal to his father's memory and saw the young prince as the true future of Pontus. These men were his teachers and his guardians. They were old soldiers, huntsmen, and guides who knew the secret ways of the mountains. In the beginning, they protected him. But as the years passed, the dynamic shifted. Imagine the scene at night. Deep in a hidden valley, protected from the wind by a high rock wall. A small fire burns, casting flickering orange light on the faces of these men. They are silent for the most part. In the wilderness, unnecessary talk is discouraged. It wastes energy and drowns out the sounds of the night. They sit around the fire, mending gear, sharpening iron arrowheads with whetstones. The rhythmic she-dash, she-sound cutting through the quiet. They share the meat they hunted together, cut in strips from a roasted haunch with their daggers. Mithridates sits among them, not above them. He eats the same food, sleeps on the same hard ground. The intense hierarchy of the court has dissolved into the simple brotherhood of survival. Yet, even here, there is a difference. As he grew stronger, as his natural intelligence applied itself to the problems of the wild, the men began to look to him not just as a charge to be protected, but as a leader. They saw the fire in his eyes that matched the comet of his birth. They saw his refusal to break under the pressure of hunger or cold. Around these campfires, in the heart of the untamed land, the loyalty forged was stronger than any bought with gold in the capital. These men would follow him anywhere because they had seen him at his rawest. And he had endured. The shadow of the future as the 7th year in the wilderness drew to a close. Mithridates was no longer running away. He was simply waiting. He had mastered his environment. The mountains were no longer a terrifying labyrinth, but a fortress he knew intimately. He knew where the fresh water springs bubbled up from the earth, even in the driest summers. He knew the hidden caves where an army could shelter unseen. He knew the passes that could be defended by a handful of men against thousands. The wilderness had done its work. It had taken a frightened boy and hammered him into a king made of iron and oak. He had absorbed the patience of the mountain, the ferocity of the wolf, and the resilience of the stone. The time was approaching when he would need to turn his gaze back toward the sea, back toward the city of white stone that had tried to kill him. But he would not return as a victim. He would return as something elemental, a force of nature that had been brewing in the high, dark places of the earth. Now, let the fire burn down to glowing embers. The forest is quiet, save for the hoot of an owl and the rustle of wind in the high pines. The prince is sleeping deeply, a dreamless sleep of the strong. Rest here with him in the safety of the wild, before the complex poisons of civilization touch his lips again. The wilderness had completed its primary education. 7 years among the high peaks and dark valleys of Pontus had stripped the prince, Mithridates, of every vestige of palace softness. He was a creature of sinew, silence, and instinct. But the mountains were not merely a school for the body. They were also a sanctuary for forgotten minds. The physical transformation needed an intellectual counterpart, a forging of the inner self to match the hardness of the outer shell. The story now shifts from the grand theater of the natural world to the contained, precise intensity of the scholar's cell, the discovery of the stone library. It was in the 8th year of his self-imposed exile, late in a severe autumn, that Mithridates stumbled upon the place. Following an injured wild boar he had tracked for 2 days. The chase led him into a canyon so narrow and choked with dense brushwood that it had remained hidden even from the local tribesmen who claimed to know every secret path at the canyon's dead end. A waterfall fed by the seasonal surge veiled the entrance to a large, crescent-shaped cave. It was a common feature of the Anatolian landscape, often serving as little more than a den for bears during the winter. But as Mithridates pushed through the water's mist, he noticed something unnatural. The stone floor had been leveled, and the walls bore the unmistakable marks of human masonry. Imagine now the atmosphere within that cavern. The air was cool, dry, and utterly still, possessing the dead scent of undisturbed antiquity, a mix of cold mineral dust and the ghost of old oils. Here, deep within the mountain's core, an ancient structure lay preserved. This was not a military fort or a tomb, but a repository of knowledge. It was a library hewn from the living rock. The space was immense, carved into 2 main chambers. The first chamber, clearly an antechamber, contained niches holding desiccated fragments of votive offerings to forgotten deities, small clay figures, bronze tools oxidized green, and the crumbling remains of dried herbs tied with thread that dissolved at a touch. The second chamber, however, was the revelation. It was a circular room, its dome precisely carved to allow a single narrow shaft of light to penetrate from above, tracking the sun's movement like a celestial clock. Along the walls, cut into the stone, were shelves filled with scrolls and tablets. These were not the papyrus scrolls of Alexandria, which would have long ago turned to powder in the damp air. These were thin, meticulously prepared sheets of treated leather, bound tightly and waxed with a pitch that had miraculously protected them. Beside the scrolls were clay tablets, covered in the cuneiform script of Mesopotamian kingdoms, and others etched with the dense, precise Greek of later scholarship. This was a convergence point, a library that held the knowledge of 3 worlds, the secrets of the Persian Magi, the practical pharmacology of the coastal Greeks, and the deep, chthonic wisdom of the indigenous Anatolian priests, the guardian of the secret. Mithridates was not alone. Huddled in the faint glow of a small, carefully tended lamp, an old man sat bent over a low stone table. This was not a king's advisor or a court philosopher. This was a true solitary, a man whose life had been dedicated to the pursuit of specific, meticulous knowledge. His name was Deidrus, or perhaps it was not. Names in this solitude were less important than purpose. He was the guardian, the silent custodian of the mountain's secret. Deidrus was a sight to behold, a vision of austere longevity. His skin was parchment thin, stretched taut over a high-boned face, and his eyes, magnified by ancient, crudely polished lenses of quartz, were the deep, liquid brown of good old wine. He was dressed in simple patched wool garments, that seemed to blend with the gray rock dot. He did not startle when Mithridates entered, did not look up from the tablet he was translating. His composure was absolute. "You are late," Diodrus said, his voice a dry, papery whisper that was nonetheless utterly firm. Mithridates, the hardened warrior who had faced down mountain bandits and wrestled wolves, felt suddenly like a boy caught raiding the larder. He lowered his spear. "I was not aware I was expected, Old One," the prince replied, his tone instinctively respectful. Diodrus finally lifted his gaze. He looked at Mithridates for a long time, not at the furs or the weapons, but into his eyes. "The star that guided you from your mother's treachery has guided you here. The mountain knows its purpose. It kept the secrets for you. You were expected when the soft blood had been burned away by the hard years. Now we begin the true work." The science of pharmaca, the work, Diodrus explained, was the mastery of pharmaca. The Greek term is often translated simply as drug or medicine, but its true meaning is richer, holding the duality of both remedy and poison. In the ancient world, power was held by three things: the sword, the law, and the secret knowledge of substances. Mithridates' father had died by the swift, silent violence of poison, a common tool of court intrigue, a weapon that leaves no blood on the assassin's hand. To rule an empire, one must first master its most insidious enemy. The curriculum Diodrus laid out was not swift or exhilarating. It was agonizingly slow and exhaustive. It was the epitome of the boring history style, a tribute to the meticulous, unseen labor that underlies grand historical action. Imagine the daily routine: botany and foraging, long, silent hours spent on the mountain slopes, not hunting, but gathering. Mithridates was taught to distinguish between the hundreds of green and gray plants of the region. He learned the deadly purple flowers of the aconite, the numbing properties of hemlock, and the hallucinogenic effects of the nightshade family. The crucial lesson: knowing precisely what time of day to harvest a root, which soil provided the most potent leaf, and whether to use the first or second year growth of a stalk. Diodrus stressed that the difference between a life-saving antidote and a lethal dose often lay in the meticulous counting of drops, or the grinding of 1-minute grain too many. Mineralogy and distillation, they did not seek to turn lead into gold. Their alchemy was far more practical, the mastery of minerals. Mithridates was taught to grind cinnabar for its mercury content, to reduce lead-based minerals to their core elements, and to use sulfur and asphalt from the Pontic mines to create flammable compounds. In the deepest part of the cave, away from the scrolls, a small, intricate array of alembics and glassware sat upon a specialized stone hearth. Mithridates spent endless days watching the slow, deliberate drip of condensed vapor, learning the temperaments of heat and steam. The entire process moved at the agonizing pace of chemistry itself, waiting for a slurry to settle, for a mixture to separate, for a solution to slowly crystallize. The catalog of toxins, the Mithridatic collection. The core of the study was the creation of a massive, comprehensive antidote. Historical records would later confirm that Mithridates VI became famous for his lifelong quest for immunity. Diodrus had him catalog every known toxin, starting with the plant-based poisons of Pontus and moving to the complex mineral poisons favored by the Hellenistic courts: arsenic, lead, and copper salts. For each toxin, Mithridates had to determine three things: the lethal dose, the immediate symptoms, and the most effective counteragent. The practice of subtlety. This work required an absolute dedication to detail that Mithridates had never known. In the palace, details were handled by secretaries. Here, an error in transcription or a slight mismeasurement of a powdered root could be fatal. The prince's great natural energy, once channeled into the brute strength of the hunt, was now forced into the narrow, precise channel of scholarship. He had to learn the meditative stillness of the scholar. Imagine him in the cave, the shaft of sunlight illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above the scrolls. He is bent over a wax tablet, scratching notes with a stylus, his large, calloused hands moving with an unnerving delicacy. He translates a passage of Babylonian medical text, a tedious list of herbs and their uses, and then cross-references it with a contemporary Greek text on the four humors. The smell of the space is no longer just dust. It is a blend of aged wax, dry leather, and the sweet, cloying aroma of certain toxic plants, kept in sealed, labeled jars. Diodorus rarely spoke. His lessons were given through silence and subtle correction. If Mithridates mistakenly used a porous piece of clay for a decoction, Diodorus would simply tap the tablet and wait. The prince would eventually realize his mistake. The clay would absorb the essential oils, ruining the mixture. Patience was not a virtue here. It was a precondition for survival. The awakening of the alchemist over the course of the next 2 years, the final layers of the prince's youth were shed. He stopped viewing the knowledge as a means to avoid death and began to see it as a means to master life. The pharmaca were not just chemicals. They were keys to understanding the hidden mechanics of the world. By mastering poison, he mastered its opposite, medicine. By understanding what broke the body, he learned what healed it. This fusion of deadly knowledge and healing skill would become the signature of his reign. The true awakening, however, came during the process of inoculation. As he grew more confident in his mastery of the antidotes, he and Diodorus began the terrifying regimen of Mithridatism, the slow, deliberate introduction of small sublethal doses of toxins into his system, followed immediately by the neutralizing counteragents. Imagine the prince's body, convulsing slightly, his heart racing, his vision blurring, as a minute amount of viper venom or white arsenic was introduced to his blood. It was a conscious flirting with death, a daily dance on the edge of the grave. With each successful neutralization, the body's tolerance grew, and the prince's mind became sharper, his resolve iron-clad. He was not merely surviving the poison. He was absorbing it, making it part of his constitution. He was turning his own body into a fortress, impregnable to the secret weapons of his enemies. By the time Diodorus finally nodded, a flicker of approval in his ancient eyes, Mithridates no longer needed his teacher. He had internalized the slow, meticulous pace of the alchemist. He understood that true, lasting power came not from grand, explosive acts, but from the cumulative, unnoticed strength, built through quiet dedication. The prince was now ready. He had the body of a barbarian king, honed by the wilderness, and the mind of an alchemist, hardened by the laboratory. The time of hiding was over. The time of reckoning and a legendary return was about to begin. If you close your eyes now and allow your mind to settle, you can feel the slow, inevitable movement of destiny. We have witnessed the young prince, Mithridates, disappear into the harsh geometry of the Pontic Mountains, a place where he was stripped down, reforged by nature, and finally educated in the secret language of life and death. Now, after nearly a decade of absence, the time has come for the mountain to release its treasure. The return of Mithridates was not a frantic, urgent flight back to the throne. It was a calculated, deliberate emergence, a slow unwinding from the wilderness, timed not by impatience but by political calculation. He waited until the seeds of discontent that his mother, Queen Laodice, had sown through her grasping, unstable regency were fully ripe for harvest. The descent from the heights, imagine the descent. It is late spring. The snow has mostly retreated, leaving the mountain slopes carpeted in rich, emerald green grass and explosions of wildflowers, purple crocus, white snowdrops, and yellow buttercups. The rivers, swollen with snowmelt, roar through the valleys, a constant, low thunder. Mithridates leads his small loyal band of companions, the men who had shared his fires and his hunger. They are no longer just hunters. They are soldiers bound by the unique fellowship of shared extremity. They move with the fluid silence of predators. They are not an army, but the sharp tip of a psychological spear dot as they travel down. The air grows warmer and heavier, rich with the smell of fertile soil. The scent of salt, long forgotten, begins to drift inland on the evening breeze. The sounds of civilization slowly seep back into their world. The distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the bark of a shepherd's dog, the murmur of human voices. Mithridates, the former prince who is now a king shaped by the earth, studies this familiar yet alien world. His eyesight, honed by years of hunting in low light, picks out the details. He notices the state of the roads, unmaintained, eroded by rain and neglect. He sees the fields, some fallow, others poorly managed. The subtle signs of weak governance are clear everywhere. A kingdom is merely a reflection of its ruler's will, and the will of his mother, Laodice, was self-serving and small. The gathering of Whispers Mithridates did not march on the capital of Sinope immediately. Instead, he stopped in the remote inland Persian strongholds, the places where the old Anatolian nobility held sway. These were the areas most resistant to the Hellenistic influence favored by his Greek-born mother, Laodice. He presented himself not as a claimant, but as a long-lost son of the earth. He came with no gold, no silks, but with the raw authority of a man who had faced death daily and survived. His very appearance was a calculated statement: the long, wind-swept hair, the sun-darkened skin, the garments of simple, sturdy leather, the muscles that spoke of real physical hardship, not gymnasium training. He spoke not in the polished Greek of the court, but in the rougher, older dialects of the countryside, the languages of the people who worked the land and feared the gods of the mountains. The rumors of his survival, which had been dismissed as peasant superstitions by the Queen Regent, suddenly gained form and substance. The whispers traveled faster than any courier. The prince is back. He who was raised by the wolves has returned. He drinks the poison, and it does not harm him. These rumors created a mythic shield around him. The people, tired of the heavy taxation and the corrupt Roman-aligned policies of Laodice, were drawn to this figure of raw, untainted power. The mystery surrounding his years in the wilderness acted as a powerful psychological weapon. They did not see a prince. They saw an avenger, favored by the fire and the stars. The strategy of the stain, while Mithridates remained geographically distant. He began his campaign of destabilization. He used trusted agents and messengers to spread meticulously crafted stories that focused on his mother's failings. He did not accuse her of murder directly. That would be a palace matter. Instead, he focused on the issues that affected the common man: financial ruin. Laodice had wasted the state treasury on lavish parties and Roman bribes. Foreign influence: she had favored Roman interests, allowing their tax collectors and merchants to dominate the Black Sea trade. Humiliating the proud Pontic identity. The fate of the brother. He circulated rumors that his younger brother, Chrestus, the co-ruler, was merely a puppet, weakened by Laodice's drugs, and that the queen was secretly planning to surrender Pontus to Rome entirely. This strategy of erosion, a slow, patient staining of the queen's reputation, was learned from the wilderness. Not a sudden, loud strike, but the slow, persistent action of water eroding stone. He allowed the queen and her weak, entitled brother to exhaust their own power through their arrogance. The court of the serpent. And the dove let us refocus on the palace of Sinope, where Queen Laodice reigns. Imagine the atmosphere inside that marble shell. It is a place of forced celebration and brittle fear. The banquets are still grand, the music loud, but the smiles of the courtiers do not reach their eyes. They are listening. They are waiting. Every time a door creaks or a messenger arrives, the air in the great hall tightens. Laodice herself is a woman struggling to maintain control. She is a Hellenistic queen, relying on Greek sophistication and Roman support. She dismisses the rumors of her son's return as barbaric fantasy. He is dead, choked by the mud and the wolves of the mountains, she would declare. But even she could not ignore the fact that the tax revenues had dried up, and her own guards were beginning to exchange uneasy glances. She was relying heavily on a small coterie of corrupt Greek and Roman advisors. These men, far from comforting her, were simply preparing their own escape routes, stuffing silver into bags and making arrangements with the nearest Roman fleets. The moment the loyalist nobles of Pontus heard Mithridates was alive, they began to slip away. They left Sinope quietly, one by one, heading inland towards the mountains, their horses loaded with weapons and supplies. The court was hemorrhaging power without a single sword being drawn. The appearance, day Mithridates finally entered Sinope, was not marked by a siege or a battle, but by a chilling, profound silence. He did not wait for the city gates to be opened. He and his core band simply rode in during the bustling midday market, moving through the astonished crowd. His arrival was so utterly unexpected, so devoid of fanfare, that it was instantly recognized as an act of absolute, unassailable power. Imagine the scene in Niagara, the shouting of the merchants, the bleating of the goats, the noise of daily life, and then a sudden, collective gasp that travels outward from the port like a ripple. Silence descends. The smell of fish and spice is replaced by the raw, clean scent of the mountain wind. Mithridates stops his horse in the center of the market square. His clothes are still simple, his demeanor utterly calm. He makes no demands. He looks slowly, deliberately at the faces of the people. He is not a tyrant seeking submission. He is a shepherd reclaiming his flock. The crowd's reaction is immediate and visceral. They fall to their knees. This is the moment the mythical prince, the survivor of the comet, the lord of the poison, becomes the recognized king. The taming of the palace, the procession to the palace was slow, silent, and entirely unavoidable. No one dared block the path. The few guards who remained loyal to Laodice stood frozen at the palace gate. They saw the hard gleam in Mithridates' eye, the physical intensity of his presence, and the unyielding loyalty of the men around him. They lowered their spears without a fight. Mithridates walked into the great hall, the same place where his father had been poisoned. The room was prepared for a small, tense midday meal. Queen Laodice sat at the head table, her face pale beneath her heavy cosmetics, her eyes wide with a terror that finally eclipsed her arrogance. The confrontation was swift, clean, and entirely verbal. Mithridates did not rage. Rage is the sign of weakness, the loss of control. He stood before her and addressed her not as a son, but as a king addressing a treacherous subject. He laid out her crimes with cold, factual precision: the murder of his father, the wasting of the treasury, the humiliation of Pontus before Rome, the attempt on his own life. Laodice tried to speak, tried to appeal to maternal love, tried to beg for mercy, but the words withered on her tongue. The atmosphere he carried, the icy stillness of the mountain, the focused intelligence of the alchemist, was a psychological force she could not withstand. The justice of the king, justice administered by Mithridates, was pragmatic, not emotional. First, the fate of his brother, Crestus. The younger prince, having served as a puppet, was deemed too weak, too tainted by Laodice's influence, to be allowed to live. Mithridates had him quietly executed. This was a necessary message to the Hellenistic court. The divided rule was over. There would be one undisputed authority. Second, the fate of the queen mother Laodice. Her punishment was the most psychologically devastating. Mithridates did not execute her outright. Instead, he stripped her of all power, wealth, and status, locking her away in the deepest part of the palace, the very place she had once used to plot his death. He ensured that her final years would be spent in the silence of her own failure, contemplating the cold, hard ambition that had destroyed her family. Third, the Roman-aligned advisors. These were publicly and spectacularly executed. This was the first loud warning shot fired across the bow of the Roman Republic. He seized their fortunes, redistributed the seized wealth to the loyalist Pontic nobles, and publicly burned all their documents relating to Roman debt and trade agreements. Within a single day, the 7 years of internal corruption were purged. The kingdom of Pontus was cleansed not just of weak leadership, but of foreign economic and political influence. The coronation under the new star Mithridates VI Eupator, the good father, now stood alone upon the throne. His coronation was held swiftly, designed to unite the diverse elements of his newly solidified realm. It was a synthesis of the two great civilizations that ran in his blood. The ceremony began in the Persian fashion, with ancient fire rituals performed by magi in the high temple near Sinope. Emphasizing his lineage from Cyrus the Great, he was crowned as the King of Kings of the Anatolian people, the protector of the Eastern traditions. It was followed by a public feast in the Greek Agora, where he addressed his people in clear, resonant Greek, offering gifts, lowering taxes, and promising a return to Pontic strength and prosperity. And as the ceremony concluded, witnesses claimed the great comet, which had heralded his birth, seemed to flare briefly again in the evening sky. Or perhaps it was just the power of suggestion, working on minds that had witnessed the impossible return of their true king. The exile was over. The prince who left the city was a terrified boy. The man who returned was an alchemist of power, a survivor whose every movement was calculated, and whose very breath seemed to carry the scent of the wild, cold mountains. The kingdom was his. Now he needed to make it unbreakable. And for that, he would turn his attention back to the silent, meticulous work he had begun in the cave. The art of toxicology. The noise of the court, the clamor of the city, and the drama of the palace coup have faded. We move now from the spectacle of the return to the quiet, ceaseless work of absolute control. The physical kingdom of Pontus was secure, but the kingdom of Mithridates' mind was not. It remained a fortress under perpetual siege. Let your mind settle on the image of the royal palace at Sinope. It has been thoroughly purged, cleansed of his mother's conspirators and Roman sympathizers. Yet the air is not calm. It is thick with a different kind of tension, the icy, pervasive stillness that comes from the certainty of unseen threat. Mithridates had learned his lessons in the most brutal school imaginable, his own family. The greatest danger does not come from the enemy outside the walls, but from the friend who shares your wine. His life's foundational trauma, the poisoned goblet of his father, had created an irreversible psychological structure. The architecture of paranoia. The palace as a fortress of the mind. Mithridates approached the security of his person not as a luxury of kingship, but as a discipline, a philosophical necessity. His entire administration was restructured around the principle of absolute distrust. Imagine the palace now, operating under new rules. It is a maze of overlapping jurisdictions designed specifically to prevent any single person from gaining enough influence to strike. The guards. The royal guard was divided into several distinct, isolated units. There was the inner circle, composed of the hardened veterans who had shared his years in the wilderness. These men were fiercely loyal, almost fanatical, and they controlled access to his private chambers. Then there were the outer rings, recruited from various remote tribes of Pontus and Cappadocia. These groups spoke different dialects, worshipped different gods, and were often deliberately positioned at cross purposes, ensuring that they mistrusted and spied upon one another. If a conspiracy started, it would likely fracture before it could even cross a courtyard. The stewards and tasters. The service staff was an elaborate hierarchy designed to introduce so many steps between the source of the food and the king's lips that assassination became mathematically impossible. There were those who procured the food, those who prepared it, those who plated it, and finally, the royal tasters. These weren't merely slaves. They were often highly trained officials, each specializing in different classes of poisons, mineral, animal, or herbal. They tasted every dish and every sip of wine. But even the tasters were suspect. They were replaced randomly and often, never serving for long enough to build a reliable connection with the kitchen, staff, or a powerful court faction. The result was a court of profound, almost religious silence. Conversation was hushed. Gestures were minimal. Every person knew they were being watched, and often, they did not know by whom. This system of pervasive, structured suspicion was the king's greatest defense. The king's schedule, ritualized survival. Mithridates' personal schedule was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, designed to eliminate predictability. A king must be predictable to an army, but never to an assassin. He had no fixed rising or sleeping hours. He might sleep for 4 hours in the afternoon, or for 2 hours in 4 different locations across the palace complex in a single night. A secret series of tunnels and hidden chambers, known only to himself and 1 or 2 trusted men, allowed him to move unseen. A chamber would be prepared for his sleep, complete with a double-checked seal on the door, only for the king to decide at the last minute to sleep in the watchtower overlooking the sea. This constant movement kept his physical location a mystery. More importantly, it exhausted and confused anyone tasked with observing him. The human mind craves routine. Mithridates provided none, but his day began with one immutable, terrifying ritual: the preparation of the Mithridatum, the discipline of the antidote. Knowledge he had gained in the mountain cave now became the central pillar of his reign. The making of the great antidote was not just a medical act. It was a daily act of philosophical defiance against death. Imagine a small, secluded room in the palace complex, accessible only by a hidden door. It is his laboratory, his inner sanctum. It is clean, dry, and smells sharply of distilled alcohol, sulfur, and powerful exotic herbs. Here, he kept his toxicological library, the detailed notes, scrolls, and clay tablets he had gathered and transcribed during his exile, containing the lore of Persian magi, Egyptian chemists, and Greek physicians. The Mithridatum was his grand project, an attempt to create a universal antidote against every known poison. The final recipe, later documented by the Romans, was astonishing in its complexity, containing 54 individual ingredients: the exotics, opium, saffron, ginger, and cinnamon, expensive imports that masked the taste of baser toxins; the minerals, small, carefully measured pinches of certain oxidized metals, including traces of copper and zinc, administered not to cure, but to train the body; the biologics, the finely ground, dried flesh of vipers and other venomous creatures. The principle was simple: introduce the poison into the body in a controlled, weakened form, forcing the constitution to adapt. Mithridates would spend the first 2 hours of his day in this chamber, meticulously weighing and grinding the ingredients. This was not a task he delegated. The precision required was absolute. The weight of a single poppy seed could mean the difference between a minor sickness and terminal paralysis. And then, the moment of consumption. The daily poison every morning, the king deliberately consumed a minute. Controlled dose of an actual poison, sometimes hemlock, sometimes wolfsbane, sometimes mineral salts, immediately followed by his freshly prepared meaty hridium. Imagine him standing there, the greatest king of the East, voluntarily ingesting the very thing that had killed his father. He would feel the subtle burn, the momentary dizziness, the rapid increase in his heart rate. His body, already trained by years in the wilderness, would react swiftly, neutralizing the toxin with the help of the antidote. This practice served multiple purposes: physical immunity. It incrementally increased his tolerance to all known poisons, making a swift, fatal poisoning attempt impossible. Any assassin would have to deliver an absurdly massive dose, which would be impossible to hide in food or wine. Mental fortitude. It was a daily confrontation with death. By tasting the void every morning and stepping back, his fear of mortality was sublimated into quiet, absolute confidence. He knew, with an empirical certainty that no other king could claim, that he was shielded. Psychological warfare, the rumors of his immunity, were his most powerful weapon. His enemies, especially the Romans, were acutely aware of the tale of the Poison King, the mere belief that he could not be killed by the most common form of assassination made negotiating with him terrifying. The Romans learned that to defeat Mithridates, they had to defeat him face to face on the battlefield, a risk they were often reluctant to take. The royal observer, beyond the physical and chemical defenses, Mithridates deployed his sharpest tool, his mind. Honed by years of intense study and paranoia, he did not rely solely on spies and informants, though he had many. He relied on observation. He had trained himself, during his years of hunting, to read minute details of human behavior that others missed. Imagine him presiding over a meeting of his war council. He is listening to the report on troop movements, but his eyes are tracking something else. The subtle tremor in a general's hand when he reaches for a glass of water. The fraction of a second too long that an official holds eye contact. The slight, unconscious lean toward a Confederate during a specific, sensitive part of the discussion, because he had trained himself to spot the almost imperceptible discoloration of poisoned wine. He was also trained to spot the imperceptible flicker of guilt, ambition, or fear in a man's face. His intense, unblinking gaze became his most famous trait, a deep, unnerving stare that seemed to pierce straight through the polite facade of the courtier and into the soul beneath. No man could comfortably lie under the inspection of the Poison King. The shadow of the brother, the fate of his younger brother, Crestus, served as a perpetual chilling monument to the king's seriousness. Crestus, the co-regent preferred by Laodice, was executed quickly and silently upon Mithridates' return. This was not just political housekeeping. It was a necessary architectural element of the paranoia. The message was clear. No blood tie, no shared history, no appeal to sentiment would prevent the swift removal of the threat. By killing his own brother, Mithridates ensured that every noble, every distant relative, and every ambitious general understood the cold, absolute finality of his will. The air in the palace was thus purified of all familial sentimentality. Leaving only pure, crystalline obedience, the king lived in a state of supreme, self-imposed isolation, protected by his own intelligence, his botanical knowledge, and his unyielding paranoia. He slept without fear, not because he was safe, but because he was certain that if death came, he would be the first to know its face. This was the quiet power of Mithridates VI. He had transformed the most vulnerable aspect of ancient monarchy, the reliance on others for safety, into a unique, unassailable strength. The poison that killed his father had given him life, and the fear of treachery had given him absolute control. He was the king of Pontus, master of the Black Sea, and he was ready for the greatest danger of all, the rising tide of the Roman Republic in the West. He was shielded against the poison of the assassin. Now he prepared to face the poison of Roman ambition. Take a moment now to breathe in deeply, and then release it slowly. Let the image of the isolated, paranoid palace fade. The king, Mithridates VI, is no longer focused inward on the threat of the poisoned cup. His gaze, hardened by years of exile and focused by the clarity of the alchemist's mind, is now fixed firmly upon the western horizon, the kingdom of Pontus. Under his new, ruthless, and highly organized rule, was stable. The corruption was purged. The treasury was filling. The local peoples, weary of Roman economic exploitation, were filled with a fierce, renewed sense of Pontic identity. But true sovereignty in the ancient world was not defined by internal prosperity. It was defined by external independence. And to the west, there was a vast, insatiable entity that brooked no rivals, The Roman Republic. The geography of inevitability. The core conflict between Mithridates and Rome was not born of personal hatred, but of geographical and economic necessity. Imagine the map again. Rome, having shattered Carthage and conquered Greece, now controlled the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea. The sea was their mare nostrum, our sea. But for Rome to truly dominate the East, they needed to control the final great waterway, the Black Sea, Pontus Euxinus. The Black Sea was the key to infinite resources: grain from the rich fields of the Ukraine, timber for shipbuilding from the dense Crimean forests, gold from the Caucasus, and vital slaves from the northern tribes. Pontus, situated perfectly on the southern coast, was the gatekeeper to all of this. Mithridates was holding the lock, and Rome held the key of ambition. For years, Rome had used subtle weapons, debt, bribery, and political pressure to hollow out the kingdoms of Anatolia. They didn't always need legions. Their tax collectors and bankers were often enough. Mithridates had witnessed this slow, insidious poisoning of the East firsthand through the corruption of his mother. He knew that to simply resist Rome was not enough. He had to create a geopolitical shield that was as effective as his personal antidote: the northern expansion, securing the granary. Mithridates' first major strategic moves were not directed at Rome, but at the wild, vital lands bordering the northern Black Sea. He understood that whoever controlled the grain fields of the Crimea and the Bosphorus Straits controlled the economic arteries of the region. Imagine the long, slow voyages of his fleet. Pontic ships, sturdy, well-armed triremes, sailed north, across the often treacherous waters. His goals were ambitious but methodical: the kingdom of Bosporus. This vital kingdom, located on the modern-day Crimean Peninsula, was the granary of the ancient world. It supplied the grain that fed the massive populations of the Aegean. Mithridates did not conquer it with brute force. He received an urgent appeal from its Hellenic city-states, who were being threatened by the brutal Scythian tribes of the steppes. Mithridates offered protection, and the cities, willingly submitting to the king of Pontus, were absorbed into his realm. He presented himself as a savior of Hellenic culture against the northern barbarians. The Scythian Wars, the Deep Cold. This was Mithridates' first major military campaign, fought in the bleak, endless landscape of the Ukrainian steppes. It was a war against the horse archers of the vast plains, a fight against wind, snow, and a perpetually moving enemy. Mithridates, with his wilderness-honed stamina, adapted perfectly. His generals, trained in the mountain passes, learned to counter the swift movements of the steppe nomads. This war was long, grinding, and slow. But the victory brought Mithridates immense prestige, control over the key trade routes, and a seemingly limitless supply of ferocious Scythian cavalry troops, who would prove to be invaluable in the coming wars with Rome, the Western ambition. The dominoes fall with his northern flank secure and his coffers full of Crimean gold and grain. Mithridates turned to the west, toward the Greek-speaking coastal kingdoms of Anatolia. These lands were nominally independent, but effectively Rome's satellites. His strategy here was one of calculated intervention, presented as liberation: Cappadocia and Bithynia. These small kingdoms bordered Pontus and were constantly manipulated by the Roman Senate. Mithridates began a long, complex diplomatic chess game, placing his own relatives on their thrones, then removing them, then reinstalling them. He was treating the Roman clients like pawns, testing the patience and reach of the distant republic. The propaganda of liberation. Mithridates was a master of political spin. He commissioned Greek scholars to write histories and pamphlets that extolled his Persian lineage, portraying him as the last true king of the East, a modern successor to Darius, who had come to free the Greek cities from the Latin barbarians of Rome. He understood that ideas, like poisons, could spread virulently and prepare the ground for war. The Greek cities, tired of the heavy-handed oversight of Roman governors and tax farmers, began to listen to the whisper of freedom coming from Pontus. The Roman response: a lack of focus for many years. Rome remained frustratingly indifferent to Mithridates' actions. The Republic was a massive, slow-moving organism plagued by its own internal feuds. Imagine the Senate in Rome, senators arguing over land reform, massive political bribery, and the ambitions of powerful generals like Sulla and Marius. Anatolia was distant, exotic, and largely seen as a place to extract wealth. They sent low-level diplomats and minor generals, men obsessed with lining their own pockets, not with strategic warfare. Mithridates treated these Roman envoys with a chilling mixture of feigned respect and subtle defiance. He would charm them with grand gifts, display his immense wealth, and then casually reverse every diplomatic concession they thought they had secured. He was patient. He knew that Rome was vulnerable during its civil struggles. The conflict thus remained cold, a war of words, maps, and treasury balances. Until, finally, a Roman official blundered. The spark, the invasion of Bithynia, the inevitable flashpoint came around. 89 BC, King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, a Roman puppet, was desperately short of money. At the urging of a local Roman governor, he was encouraged to invade Pontus. The plan was simple: attack Mithridates, lose, and then beg Rome to send legions, thus incurring massive debt to the Republic and allowing Rome to formally annex the territory. It was a scheme rooted in greed and typical Roman financial manipulation. Mithridates, who had been waiting for a casus belli, a cause for war that would look defensive to the world, was ready. He moved with the precision of the alchemist mixing a lethal dose. Swift, accurate, and with overwhelming force, he did not just repel Nicomedes. He shattered the Bithynian army instantly, chasing the king out of his own kingdom. The Roman governor who instigated the conflict watched in horror as Mithridates' well-trained, multi-ethnic army featuring Pontic spearmen, Scythian cavalry, and Greek siege engineers swept across the landscape. This was no longer a diplomatic skirmish. Mithridates had not only defeated Rome's puppet, he had humiliated the Republic's authority in Asia. The storm had broken. The moment of decision. The Asiatic Vespers with Bithynia conquered. Mithridates found himself the master of all Asia Minor, up to the borders of the Roman province itself. He stood at a crossroads: consolidate his gains or take the final terrifying leap. That he chose the leap. He understood the Roman mind. They did not respect cautious diplomacy. They respected blood and terror. He had to make the Roman presence in Asia toxic and unbearable overnight. He had to turn the Greek population, which was still wavering, decisively to his side. What followed was the most chilling, calculated act of genocide in the early Roman imperial period, an event known to history as the Asiatic Vespers or the Ephesian Vespers. Imagine the spring of 88 BC. Mithridates' agents, trained in years of silent court observation, were already in place across dozens of Greek cities in the Roman province of Asia. These cities, Ephesus, Pergamum, Adramyttium, were home to thousands of Roman and Italian settlers, bankers, tax collectors, merchants, and landowners who had grown rich off the suffering of the local populace. The king issued a single, terrifying secret order to all his governors and the local authorities who had sided with him. The order was simple: on a fixed day, at a fixed hour, every single Roman or Italian settler man, woman, and child was to be massacred. The penalty for failing to comply was death. The reward for participation was liberation from crushing debt, as Mithridates promised to cancel all debts owed to Roman creditors. The night of silence. Imagine the horror of that day. It was not a battle. It was a purge. In Ephesus, the scene was chilling. The inhabitants stripped the Romans naked and murdered them in the gymnasium, the very symbol of Greek culture, leaving their bodies exposed. In Pergamon, citizens used the very Greek invention of the hammer and chisel to carve through the skulls of the Roman settlers. On the island of Delos, a sacred place of pilgrimage, thousands of Italians were hunted down and slaughtered by local militias. The total death toll is estimated by historians to have been between 80,000 and 150,000 people wiped out in a single coordinated, premeditated strike across an entire province. Why this extreme measure? Mithridates was applying a political form of his toxicological principle, no neutrality. By forcing the Greek cities to participate in the slaughter, he had made them complicit. They had blood on their hands. There was no going back to Roman rule. Their only option was absolute loyalty to King Mithridates, their savior and their co-conspirator. The storm had not just risen. It had broken. The aftermath and the waiting, the shock in the East was absolute. The shock in Rome was seismic. The East saw Mithridates not just as a king, but as a liberator who had finally severed the corrupt heart of the Republic's Asian network. For the first time in over a century, Roman authority in the East had been swept away by an enemy king. Mithridates VI was now the master of Asia Minor. He controlled vast territories, immense wealth, and a dedicated, unified population. He knew, however, that the silence was temporary. The news would reach Rome, and while Rome was paralyzed by civil war between the factions of Marius and Sulla, the Republic was not dead. It was merely wounded. The Asiatic Vespers was a challenge written in blood, a personal, deadly gauntlet thrown down to the most powerful military machine the world had ever known. Mithridates retreated to his palace, preparing his forces, his body, and his mind. The diplomatic game was over. The great wars were about to begin, and they would define the next 2 decades of his life. He had mastered the internal poison of the court. Now, he faced the external poison of the Roman Republic itself. Let us now enter a moment of profound quiet in history. A moment that hangs like heavy, humid air before a cataclysm. We have reached the culmination of Mithridates' strategic patient war against the influence of the Roman Republic. He had built his military alliances, secured his treasury, and unified the populace of Pontus. Now he prepared to use his ultimate, terrifying weapon. The spring of 88 BC, the coastal cities of the Roman province of Asia, Ephesus, Pergamum, Adramyttium, Trailes. These cities were jewels of Hellenic civilization, their temples sparkling white against the azure of the Aegean Sea. They were places of art, philosophy, and booming commerce. But beneath the veneer of Greek culture lay a festering resentment against the Roman administration. The economic poison for decades. The true Roman legions in Asia were not soldiers, but tax collectors and bankers. They were the publicani, the contractors and financiers who had loaned money at ruinous rates to the Asian cities. These loans were often backed by Roman governors who were, in turn, deeply corrupted by the publicani's bribes. The Greek cities, forced to pay immense tributes and interest, were suffocating. Temples were stripped of their gold. Public lands were seized. Citizens were sold into slavery to pay off debts. Rome had not conquered Asia with a sword. They had conquered it with a scroll and a ledger. Mithridates VI, the Poison King, understood this financial toxicity. He knew that the only way to purge the sickness was to cut out the source. Preparation, the silent signal, the execution of the plan was a masterpiece of cold, silent coordination, reflecting the king's own discipline. Methodical paranoia, imagine the scene not in one place, but simultaneously across hundreds of miles of coastline and inland territory. Mithridates trusted agentsmen recruited from the local nobility who hated the Roman tax burden, or former servants who had been paid handsomely, were installed in every major city. They were waiting for a single coded instruction, a piece of information so secret that even the governors who would carry it out did not know the date until the last possible moment. The order finally traveled not by Roman road, but by trusted Pontic messenger, moving swiftly and under constant armed guard. It was terse absolute, and bore the chilling signature of the king's will. The signal was distributed to the governors on the same day, 30 days hence, at the first hour of the evening. The Roman purge will begin. During those 30 days, the atmosphere in the Roman province was unsettlingly serene. The spring weather was perfect. The Roman merchants, comfortable in their superiority, continued their affairs, arranging shipping contracts, collecting interest payments, and preparing for their evening entertainments. They believed they were safe. They were in the heart of the Roman sphere of influence. They never imagined the depth of the hatred that surrounded them. The calm before the terror. The day was sunny and warm, typical of the Aegean coast. In Ephesus, the great port city, Roman citizens were busy in the market. They spoke loudly in Latin, walked with the arrogance of the conqueror, and demanded immediate service. Imagine the perspective of the local Greek population. They smiled, nodded, and served the Roman demands. They served them food and wine. They polished their armor. They cleaned their homes. They knew what was coming. They knew that liberation and complicity was only hours away. This forced, terrifying politeness was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire day. As the sun began its slow descent toward the sea, casting long shadows across the marble streets, an unnatural quiet settled over the cities. The usual evening bustle of the agora died down early. The local Greeks were securing their homes. They were ensuring their families were inside. They were sharpening the tools they would soon use, not swords, but kitchen knives, axes, and bronze hammers. The hour, the first star, and then it arrived. The first hour of the evening. The light was fading fast. A single bell, perhaps a temple gong, chimed in the marketplace of one city, and the signal was acknowledged at the Asiatic Vespers, named later in history after the Vesper evening prayer, was not a massive coordinated military action. It was a simultaneous civilian uprising aimed at a precise, narrow target: anyone who spoke Latin, anyone who was identified as Roman or Italian. Imagine the scene inside a Roman merchant's villa in Adramyttium. He is enjoying a rich, imported wine, perhaps discussing the profits of the day with his wife. The servants, silent and ubiquitous, enter the room. But they are not bringing the next course. They are armed with the cleavers from the kitchen. The surprise was absolute. There was no chance for defense, no opportunity to raise an alarm. The attack came from within the household, from the people they trusted to bring them water and light their lamps. The cruelty was deliberate. Mithridates had not just ordered execution. He had ensured that the local Greek populace performed the most heinous acts, thereby severing their final ties to Rome. In trails, a local woman, whose husband was murdered by a Roman centurion years earlier, led a mob that cornered a wealthy Roman moneylender in a temple. When the moneylender begged for mercy, the mob forced his small, trembling son to kill him with a knife before they executed the child as well. In Pergamum, the citizens refused to allow the Romans to use daggers or swords, which were considered honorable weapons. Instead, they forced the Romans into the city's gymnasium and killed them using dull tools and crude agricultural implements, mocking their sophisticated civilization in the process. The motivation was not mere bloodlust. It was the raw desperation of economic freedom. Mithridates had promised not only to cancel the colossal Roman debts, but to reward those who participated. The more Roman blood spilled, the greater the reward, and the greater the guarantee that Rome could never forgive or return. The night of silence and screams as the night deepened. The silence that fell over the cities was more terrifying than the noise of battle. There was no great clash of armies, only isolated acts of calculated violence in homes, baths, and marketplaces. The screams were muffled by thick walls and the vast, empty night air. The sounds were intimate: the dull thud of a body hitting stone, the sickening crunch of a blow delivered by an axe, the final, desperate plea in Latin cut short by a Pontic accent, Imagine Mithridates, miles away, perhaps in his palace at Sinope, meditating in his private study. He is likely not sleeping. He knows that across the sea, his silent toxic orders are being carried out. The king, who used precise doses of poison to train his body, was now using a precise dose of terror to train his kingdom. The death toll mounted. Horrifically, Roman administrators, targeted first, killed swiftly and without quarter. Italian merchants and bankers, killed publicly, often with their ledgers and scrolls of debt torn up and scattered over their bodies. Wives and children. Mithridates had ordered the killing of all family members. This was essential for the psychological impact. If one Romang survived, they would return, and their vengeance would be absolute. The complete removal of the Latin stain was the only guarantee of safety for the Greeks. By dawn, the coastal cities, once vibrant centers of Roman commerce, were ghost towns. The streets were stained, but the air was clean. The Roman presence, which had taken a century to build, had been erased in the span of a single night. The morning after, the reckoning, when the first rays of the sun struck the Aegean coast, they illuminated a scene of chilling finality. The local Greek populations emerged, exhausted and shaken, but also energized by a sense of terrible liberation. They quickly stripped the bodies of any remaining Roman symbols and began the process of purification. The bodies, estimated at between 80,000 and 150,000 across the region, were not buried with dignity. They were often left in public squares, a raw, brutal message to any surviving Roman travelers or spies. The debt scrolls were publicly burned in massive pyres in the agoras. The collective sense of relief from generations of debt servitude was immense, powerful enough to overcome the horror of the night's actions. The Greek cities, by participating in this massacre, were now irrevocably bound to Mithridates. There was no turning back, no possible negotiation with Rome. Their only future was as allies and defenders of the poisoned king. They had willingly entered into a blood pact, sealing the fate of the entire eastern Mediterranean. The message to the west. News of the Asiatic Vespers traveled to Rome slowly, carried by terrified survivors and neutral traders. When the Senate finally heard the full accounting, the shock was profound. This was not a border skirmish. It was a full-scale declaration of war, a direct challenge to the very foundation of Roman power. For decades, the Roman Republic had only fought enemies who were willing to play by their rules. Mithridates VI, the king who ate poison for breakfast and ruled by cold, precise calculation, was not playing by their rules. He had shown that he was willing to use terror as a strategic tool, demonstrating a level of ruthlessness that even Rome found appalling. He had inoculated his kingdom against the economic poison of Rome by injecting them with the toxic horror of massacre. The king had achieved his immediate strategic goal. Asia Minor was his, but he knew the consequences. The sleeping giant of the Republic was finally mortally wounded, and it was beginning to stir. The Roman response would not be a mere reprisal. It would be total war, aimed at nothing less than the utter destruction of the kingdom of Pontus and the capture of its dangerous, unassailable king. Mithridates had won the battle of the night. Now he would prepare for the long, grinding war of the legions. The shockwaves of the Asiatic Vespers traveled across the Mediterranean, not just on the fast ships of traders, but on the invisible currents of panic and rage. For Rome, the massacre was not merely a military defeat. It was a profound psychic wound. The Republic, already tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war between the factions of Marius and Sulla, had to stop its self-destruction just long enough to deal with the unprecedented threat from the east. The Senate, momentarily unified by fury, demanded a response written in fire. The man chosen to deliver that vengeance was not merely a general. He was an embodiment of Rome's cold, aristocratic will, Lucius Cornelius, Sull. The adversary. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Imagine Sulla. He is the perfect foil for Mithridates. Where the king of Pontus was the alchemist, the paranoid survivor, Sulla was the Magnus, the ruthless aristocrat, the master of fortune. Utterly convinced of his own destiny, Sulla was a man of intense contradictions, scholarly and cultured, yet capable of terrifying brutality. Fond of Greek literature, yet determined to crush the Greek-speaking cities that had supported Mithridates. He was a veteran of many wars, his face etched with the scars of battle and the lines of relentless ambition. He carried an aura of dangerous glamour, a man blessed by the gods, or so he claimed. Mithridates, watching Sulla's movements from his palace, knew that his opponent was no mere tax-collecting governor. Sulla was the storm itself, the civil war divergence, the unseen shield. Mithridates had calculated correctly. Rome was not whole. Just as Sulla was preparing to sail east to take command against Pontus, his bitter rival, Gaius Marius, and his faction seized Rome, Sulla was declared an outlaw. This political poison in Rome was the temporary shield for Pontus. Sulla faced an agonizing choice: abandon his legions and return home to defend his life, or sail east to save Rome's honor and secure a vast fortune for his army. Sulla chose the east. He marched his 6 legions to the port of Brundisium and, ignoring the desperate calls from his political enemies in Rome, sailed for Greece. This act cemented the civil war at home, but it bought Mithridates precious time and gifted him a unique psychological advantage. Sulla was fighting 2 wars, simultaneously, one against the king of Pontus, and one against the enemies trying to steal his power in Italy. His focus was fatally divided. The stage of conflict, Greece. The first major engagements were not fought on Pontic soil, but in Greece, where Mithridates had already sent his armies and fleets. After the Asiatic Vespers, many Greek cities, tired of Roman occupation, had openly welcomed Mithridates as a liberator. The king's generals seized control of Athens, the ancient heart of democracy and philosophy. Imagine Athens, a city of white marble and intellectual fire, now occupied by Pontic and Scythian soldiers. The sight must have been surreal. Asiatic archers patrolling the Acropolis, the scent of oriental spices mixing with the classic aroma of olive oil and thyme. When Sulla landed in Greece in 87 BC, he did not rush. He was methodical, patient, and terrifyingly efficient. He saw Greece as a necessary first step, a way to bloody his men, replenish his treasury through plunder, and send a clear, unyielding message to the east. The siege of Athens. The grinding pressure. Sulla immediately marched on Athens. This was not a quick battle. It was a long, grinding siege that lasted for months. A classic boring history focus on the logistics and the sheer persistence of Roman military engineering. Imagine the work, the steady thud of the Roman siege engines, the constant load chanting of the legionaries as they hauled massive logs and built earthworks higher than the city walls. Sulla did not storm the city. He strangled it. He cut off every supply line, every possible exit. He grew so desperate for timber to build his massive siege ramps that he ordered the felling of the sacred groves around the Academy and the Lyceum, an act of sacrilege that appalled the Greeks, but which demonstrated his absolute commitment to victory. Mithridates' general in Athens, a skilled commander named Ariston, was trapped. The king, safe across the sea, could only send meager aid. The atmosphere in Athens became one of slow starvation. The populace who had initially cheered Mithridates now suffered the consequences of his war. They ate rats, then boiled leather, and then finally nothing. In the dead of winter, Sulla finally breached the walls. The ensuing sack of Athens was brutal and uncompromising. It was not a massacre on the scale of the Vespers, but it was a demonstration of Roman fury. Sulla's men slaughtered thousands, and the ancient city was left wounded and humiliated. The message sent across the Aegean was stark. Mithridates cannot protect you from the consequences of your choices. The tactical chess match. Chaeronea and Orchomenus. The war moved to the open fields of Greece, where two major battles defined the first clash of the Titans, Chaeronea and Orchomenus. Mithridates' general, Archelaus, commanded a vast sprawling army, a gorgeous, multi-ethnic host of 60,000 men, featuring heavy Greek phalanxes, Scythian chariots, Armenian cavalry, and Pontic light infantry. It was an army of spectacle and ancient tradition. Sulla, by contrast, commanded only 15,000 highly disciplined Roman legionaries, men forged in civil war and desperation. At Chaeronea, the two armies met. Archelaus relied on the sheer volume and exotic nature of his troops. Imagine the dust and noise, the thundering charge of the Scythian chariots, their scythes flashing, crashing into the Roman lines. But Sulla's genius lay in his soldiers' discipline and their training. Mithridates' army was vast but slow to maneuver. Sulla's legions moved like quicksilver. They let the chariots pass harmlessly through their ranks and then, reforming instantly, closed ranks to engage the heavier phalanxes. The Pontic army, despite its numbers, was crushed, its exotic nature becoming a liability rather than a strength. At Orchomenus, Archelaus tried again, this time relying on the marshy terrain to protect his flanks. Sulla, with characteristic Roman pragmatism, simply ordered his men to dig massive trenches and canals, draining the marsh until the ground was firm enough for Roman infantry to maneuver. It was a victory not of martial glory, but of relentless, patient engineering, a victory of Roman earth against Pontic water. The result of these battles was devastating for Mithridates. He lost nearly 20,000 men, and crucially, he lost his ability to fight Rome on the open battlefield. Mithridates' private strategy, the Battle of Mines. During this devastating Greek campaign, Mithridates remained in Pontus, safe in his paranoia-fueled palace. While his generals bled and died in Greece, the king focused on the psychological and toxicological war. He tried to poison Sulla. Imagine the subtle maneuvering. Agents and double agents were sent into Sulla's camp, disguised as merchants, servants, and even captured Greek soldiers. These agents carried not daggers, but small pouches of exotic powders, distilled liquids, or even poison applied to the edges of parchment scrolls Sulla might touch. Sulla was equally paranoid and surrounded by men whose loyalty was bought with the promise of vast Asian plunder. The king's attempts were detected, a servant who hesitated, a gift of wine that felt too generous, a strange-smelling garment. Mithridates learned that while he could poison a single man with ease, poisoning a Roman general surrounded by desperate, loyal legions was nearly impossible. His toxicological mastery was a personal shield, but a poor strategic weapon against a massive army. The Peace of Dardanus, the bitter compromise. By 85 BC, both Mithridates and Sulla were exhausted. Mithridates had lost his armies in Greece and realized that his multi-ethnic forces, while beautiful and numerous, could not withstand the single-minded focus of Roman military discipline. Sulla was equally desperate. His political enemies, the Marian faction, were consolidating power in Rome. He had to conclude the war quickly, claim his victory and his plunder, and sail home to retake his city. He could not afford a long, grinding occupation of Asia. They met at Dardanus for a peace conference, a historic meeting of the two titans, the Poison King and the Lucky General. Imagine the scene. Two heavily armed camps, separated by a thin neutral zone. Sulla, looking tired but radiating hard, unforgiving Roman authority, stood waiting. Mithridates, arrayed in the splendor of his Persian lineage, arrived with his bodyguards, his face unreadable, his famous deep eyes observing every detail. The terms Sulla offered were harsh, but politically brilliant. Immediate retreat. Mithridates had to surrender all his conquests, including Bithynia and Cappadocia. Reparations. He had to pay a massive indemnity of 3,000 talents, an astronomical sum, to cover the cost of the war, surrender of the fleet. He had to surrender 70 of his best warships. Crucially, Sulla made one strategic concession. He did not demand the surrender of Mithridates himself, nor did he annex Pontus. Sulla needed a quick peace to get home. He left Mithridates VI intact, bruised and humiliated, but still the king of Pontus. Mithridates accepted the terms. He understood that a partial defeat was better than total destruction. He lost the first round, but he retained the ability to fight another day. He watched Sulla sail back toward Rome, knowing the debt of vengeance had only been postponed. The peace was not peace. It was a breathing pause. The clash of titans had ended in a temporary truce. Mithridates VI, the Poison King, had survived the most dangerous military force on Earth. And he would spend the next decade quietly rebuilding his armies, his focus sharper, his paranoia deeper, preparing for the inevitable second and final confrontation. Take a moment to let the clamor of war fade. The great battles against Sulla are over. The political maneuvering has momentarily ceased. The world breathes, and Mithridates VI, though defeated, is once again safe within his kingdom. But the king understands that mere survival on the battlefield is insufficient. True victory lies in the conquest of fear itself, and the final fear is death. Following the humiliating peace with Sulla, Mithridates did not immediately rebuild his legions. He retreated into his most private sanctuary, the Pharmakon laboratory deep within the palace of Sinope. He knew Rome would return, but he also knew his enemies, both foreign and domestic, would first try the silent, subtle weapon that had defined his youth: poison. To survive the Roman menace, he had to perfect his personal shield. This chapter is a quiet, meticulous journey into the mind of the Poison King, a study of ancient botany, mineralogy, and the relentless, obsessive pursuit of the ultimate truth hidden within the chemistry of the earth. The sanctuary of secrecy. Imagine the king's laboratory, nestled away from the political bustle. It is a space designed not for comfort, but for absolute sterility and focus. The room is dimly lit, relying primarily on focused oil lamps that cast an amber glow only upon the work surfaces. The floor is packed earth, covered in carefully swept layers of fine, clean sand to reveal any spilled grains of powder or stray liquids. The air here is thick and complex, smelling of exotic resins, the sharp metallic tang of sulfur, the earthy sweetness of dried roots, and the faint, unsettling aroma of snake venom. The silence is profound, broken only by the delicate sounds of the work, the soft tap-tap of a bronze pestle grinding herbs in a mortar, the steady drip-drip-drip of a liquid condensing in a clay alembic, and the low, measured voice of the king dictating notes to his scribe. Mithridates was obsessed with finding an antidote that was not merely effective against one poison, but against all of them. He was searching for the panacea, the all-cure, a concept that bordered on medical science and religious belief. His quest became known in later history as the perfection of the Mithridatum. The composition of the elixir, the final recipe for the Mithridatum, was a masterpiece of ancient pharmacology, a synthesis of hundreds of years of knowledge gathered from across his vast empire, from the Scythian shamans of the north to the Alexandrian scholars of the south. Mithridates understood that the antidote had to serve two functions: immediate counter, to neutralize active toxins in the stomach and blood; long-term immunity, to build the body's tolerance through controlled, cumulative exposure. The recipe, documented by later Roman physicians who seized his notes, was astoundingly intricate, eventually involving up to 54 different ingredients. Let us explore the quiet, tedious process of gathering and preparing just a few of the core components. The exotics, masks and calms. These were the rare, expensive components designed to disguise the bitter taste of the other ingredients and calm the body's immediate shock. Opium. Sourced from the poppy fields of Asia Minor, this was crucial for its immediate sedative effects, calming the violent convulsions and pain caused by powerful nerve agents. The king spent months determining the precise, non-addictive dose required to mitigate shock without inducing incapacitating drowsiness. Saffron and cinnamon, imported at great cost from distant lands. Their intense color and powerful, sweet aroma could mask the flavor of metallic salts like arsenic. Castoreum, derived from the beaver, known in antiquity for its strong, musky odor and purported antispasmodic properties. The naturals, the training agents. These were the plant-based poisons and their immediate counterparts. Wolfsbane, aconite, a deadly, fast-acting nerve agent common in the Pontic Mountains. Mithridates cultivated this plant himself and meticulously studied its effects. The antidote often involved a preparation of rue, or specially fermented honey known to neutralize its paralyzing effects. Licorice root and marshmallow, ground into fine powders to help coat the stomach and slow the absorption rate of poisons, buying precious time for the active agents to work out the biologics. The heart of the cure. The most mysterious and dangerous ingredients were animal-based, intended to harness the power of venom itself. Viper flesh. The king ordered his men to capture vipers, particularly the poisonous Vipera pontica. The snake's flesh was meticulously cleaned, dried, and ground into a fine powder. The ancient belief was that a small, controlled amount of the poison source itself, when mixed with neutralizing agents, could activate the body's deep resistance. This preparation was handled by the king himself, as the risk of accidental poisoning was highest. The methodology of precision. The true genius of the Mithridateum was not the list of ingredients, but the method of their preparation. This was where the prince of the wilderness became the alchemist of power. Imagine Mithridates standing over his low marble work table, his massive hands now moving with the delicacy of a jeweler. He used specialized balance scales, employing tiny counterweights made of gold dust, attempting to achieve a purity and precision that was unheard of in ancient chemistry. The process often took weeks. Drying and pulverizing. Roots and herbs had to be dried in darkness for specific periods to maximize potency, then ground into a powder finer than flour. The rhythmic swish-swish of the sieve separating the particles would fill the quiet chamber. Decoction and infusion. Certain ingredients were boiled slowly over carefully regulated temperatures, requiring continuous, patient stirring. The subtle difference between a healing infusion and a toxic brew depended on removing the mixture from the heat at the exact moment the liquid reached a specific concentration. The final mix. All 54 ingredients were then combined in large clay jars, sealed with wax and left to mature for months. The final product was a thick, dark electuaria, paste or jam, that was administered daily. The daily discipline for Mithridates. Consuming the Mithridateum was not a casual act. It was a daily act of defiance, a moment of profound internal concentration. Every morning, he would take a thumbnail-sized portion of the dark paste. He could feel the immediate, subtle reactions in his system. He would often monitor his pulse, his pupil dilation, and the color of his tongue after consumption. He was treating his own body as his most complex, important laboratory. The result of this regimen was a state of being that was superhuman. He had achieved the ultimate defense, immunization by obsession. The effect was not limited to physical safety. It fueled his legend and his psychological dominance. The tale of the king who could not be poisoned spread across the ancient world. When Roman diplomats arrived at Sinope, they did not just fear his legions. They feared the man who made death his servant. The pursuit of the greater immortality, the quest for the antidote, inevitably led Mithridates beyond mere toxicology into philosophy. Diodorus, his old mentor from the mountains, may have been dead, but his influence lingered in the scrolls. Mithridates began to see the pharmaca not just as a cure for physical ailments, but as a metaphor for governance. He came to believe that the greatest poisons were not botanical, but political: corruption, debt, and weakness. Political antidote, just as he used controlled doses of poison to train his body, he used small, controlled acts of terror and massive wealth redistribution, like the Asiatic Vespers and the cancellation of Roman debts, to inoculate his kingdom against Roman influence. The kingdom, like his body, needed to be repeatedly exposed to the threat and survive, thereby growing stronger and more loyal. The search for longevity. The idea of the panacea quickly merged with the quest for extreme longevity. Mithridates was fascinated by the idea of defeating not just a poison, but the gradual toxicity of old age itself. His later notes detailed attempts to create elixirs based on royal jelly, rare minerals, and life-extending fungi, an attempt to extend his reign indefinitely, ensuring his control would outlast the fragile. Short-term memories of the Republic senators. The laboratory was Mithridates' true throne room. Here, surrounded by the secrets of life and death, he felt truly powerful. He was a king who relied on no divine right or inherited privilege, but solely on his own intellect and relentless, patient study. But there is a chilling irony inherent in the quest for the ultimate antidote. By forcing his body to accept and neutralize all forms of death, Mithridates was unknowingly sealing his own eventual fate. He was building a biological fortress so complete that no outside force could break it. He was preparing himself for everything except the internal force that would eventually come to claim him. Betrayal. The alchemist of Pontus had perfected the recipe for physical immortality, but he had failed to find the recipe for lasting trust. The next chapter will show how the ultimate poison, the poison of the bloodline, would shatter the fortress he had so meticulously built. Let the sound of the trumpets and the marching legions fall silent for a moment. We have witnessed Mithridates' defiant rise, his sophisticated paranoia, and his brilliant, though ultimately unsuccessful, campaigns against Sulla and then Lucullus. But now we arrive at the nadir of his fortunes, the moment when the Poison King's vast empire collapses and his life is reduced once more to the primal struggle of survival. The year is 66 BC. The Roman general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, had been dispatched by Rome with an overwhelming mandate to utterly destroy Mithridates VI and formally annex the entire eastern Mediterranean. Pompey was everything Sulla was, but younger, more ambitious, and backed by the undivided will of the Republic. The final defeat and the flight, the end of the Third Mithridatic War, was swift and brutal. Mithridates, now over 60 years old, had attempted one last desperate strategic move, hoping to draw the Roman forces into a protracted, exhausting guerrilla war. But Pompey was too clever, too well supplied, and too relentless. Imagine the final battle. Fought not in a grand plain, but in the rugged terrain near the Euphrates River. Pompey surprised the Pontic camp at night. The king's soldiers, tired and demoralized, broke quickly. The battle became a rout, and Mithridates watched his last organized army dissolve into the darkness. This moment was not the death of the king, but the death of his kingdom. He was forced to flee the field with a small retinue, leaving behind his personal baggage, his treasury, and most crucially, his royal seal. His famous jewel-encrusted scabbard, a symbol of his Persian lineage, was later recovered by the Romans. The flight was immediate and absolute. Mithridates was no longer ruling. He was running. His only objective was to escape the vast, hungry net that Pompey and his legions cast across Anatolia. The strategy of the impossible escape. Mithridates' genius, even in defeat, lay in choosing the impossible path. He knew Pompey would anticipate a retreat to the south, toward Armenia or Syria, seeking refuge with other allied monarchs. Such a path would be easily tracked and swiftly cut off. Instead, Mithridates chose the north, Imagine the king turning his horse away from the fertile, familiar routes and heading directly toward the most terrifying landscape in the ancient world, the vast, frozen, impenetrable mountain chains of the Caucasus, leading to the Cimmerian Bosporus and the remote Black Sea colonies he had long ago secured. This journey was not a retreat. It was an act of geographic madness. It was a route that few armies, and certainly no organized king, had ever attempted, especially in the winter months. It was a path that required surviving not only Roman pursuit, but also the brutal, unforgiving hostility of the planet itself. Imagine the sheer scale of the environment. The air is thinning, the trails are non-existent, and the world is reduced to endless slopes of scree and icy rock. They were forced to abandon most of their horses, which could not navigate the narrow, crumbling ledges. The king, now in his mid-60s, was forced to march on foot, enduring the same physical hardship he had sought out in his youth. But this time, under the pressure of mortal urgency, the weather was their constant enemy. The passes were choked with snow, often waist-deep, requiring hours of back-breaking effort to carve a trail. The king's party, already small, began to shrink further. Some men succumbed to exposure, freezing to death in their sleep, their silent bodies left behind as monuments to the unforgiving cold. Others, despairing of the constant hunger and relentless effort, slipped away into the mountains, choosing the unknown dangers of the local tribes over the relentless march. Mithridates, however, was in his element. He was once again the solitary man of the wilderness. His iron constitution, forged by years of Mithridatism and constant physical training, allowed him to endure the cold and the hunger that broke the spirit of younger men. He relied on his vast knowledge of local botany, scrounging for edible roots and herbs beneath the snow line, ensuring his small group did not starve. The treachery of the tribes, the human element, along this route was as dangerous as the terrain. They were passing through the lands of the wild, fiercely independent tribes, the Colchians, the Iberians, and the Albanians. Mithridates, however, possessed an asset, the power of his name. Many of these tribes were descendants of the peoples he had once courted or conquered. During his northern expansion decades earlier, he sent envoys ahead, promising vast riches and a future alliance against Rome, the one enemy they all feared. The retreat became a strange, slow negotiation. Some tribes demanded heavy tributes of gold and armor to allow passage. Others were simply bought off with the promise of not being raided themselves. There were moments of tense fear, such as when the Albanian cavalry, renowned for their ferocity, tracked the party for days, testing their resolve before finally accepting tribute and offering rough guides. The king's journey was a continuous game of political roulette, balancing his desire for speed against the necessity of diplomacy to keep the hostile tribes from ending his life. The Scythian steppes and the Fayum, the long ride after months of unimaginable climbing. They finally cleared the highest ridges of the Caucasus and descended into the vast, frozen expanse of the Scythian steppes, a flat, endless landscape of snow and wind. Here, the challenge changed from climbing to riding. Mithridates was now relying on the hardy, swift horses of his Scythian allies. Imagine the scene: a long straight line of desperate riders, silhouetted against a white landscape under a vast, perpetually gray sky. The silence here is different from the mountain quiet. It is the immense, howling silence of the Great Plains, broken only by the thudding of the horses' hooves on the frozen ground and the constant roar of the wind. They rode for weeks. The cold was absolute, piercing through layers of leather and fur. The landscape offered no shelter, no hiding places. Their only defense was speed and the knowledge that no Roman general, no matter how great, would dare commit legions to this desolate, endless wasteland. Pompey's pursuit ended at the southern slopes of the Caucasus. The geography had finally defeated Rome. The arrival, the Bosporan kingdom finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mithridates reached the kingdom of Bosporus, the northernmost part of his former empire. The grain basket he had conquered decades ago, he arrived in the city of Panticapaeum, modern Kerch, not as a glorious monarch, but as a traumatized survivor, gaunt, bearded, his clothes ravaged by the elements, accompanied by fewer than 100 loyalists. The sight of the Black Sea again, no longer dark and turbulent, but frozen along the shallow harbors, must have been a profoundly moving, complicated sight. He was safe, but his safety was built on the wreckage of his life. The welcome, however, was guarded. The kingdom of Bosporus was ruled by his ambitious Hellenized son, Pharnacus II. Pharnacus had been left in charge of the Black Sea territories during the war. He was young, soft, and acutely aware that his aging, defeated father had dragged the kingdom into a ruinous war with the most powerful force on earth. The final dream, revenge from the North Mithridates, however, did not view this as a place of retirement. He saw it as a new launching pad. He immediately began to rebuild his power structure, leveraging his remaining wealth and the fanatical loyalty of the surrounding barbarian tribes. He started recruiting new armies, not Pontic spearmen, but ferocious Sarmatian and Scythian cavalrymen who despised Rome and lived to fight. His final plan, hatched in the cold, dark days of the Bosporan winter, was one of breathtaking, almost delusional ambition. He would march west. He would march through the savage, unexplored lands around the Black Sea, through Thrace and the Balkans, gathering every anti-Roman tribe along the way: Goths, Dacians, Celts. He would then cross the Danube River, march through the Alps, and launch a massive, unexpected invasion of Italy itself. He would attack Rome, the heart of the Republic, from the north, the direction from which they had never been successfully invaded. It was a grand, impossible dream, a final desperate move by a man who refused to believe he could be defeated. It was a plan that required immense resources, unwavering dedication, and most importantly, the absolute, unquestioning loyalty of his subordinates. But the long retreat had cost him not just an empire, but the trust of the one person whose ambition outweighed their filial duty, his son, Pharnacus. The young prince, watching his father plan a new, suicidal war that would surely bring Pompey and the legions to the Black Sea, made a cold, calculated decision. The king had survived the poison of the enemy, the fury of the legions, and the cold of the Caucasus. But he had not survived the poison of his own blood. The final treachery was about to unfold. Let the images of the icy steppes and the desolate mountain passes finally recede. We have followed the poison king, Mithridates VI, through wilderness, war, and the intricate science of survival. He has endured the treachery of his mother, the might of Sylla, the brilliance of Pompey, and the unforgiving cold of the frozen north. He now sits in the final corner of his once vast empire, Panticapaeum, the capital of the Bosporan kingdom, perched on the northern shore of the Black Sea. It is 63 BC. The king is old, perhaps 69. His body, though hardened by a lifetime of poison and asceticism, is weary. His spirit, however, still burns with the impossible ambition of his youth, the plan to march through the barbarian lands and invade Italy, the final dream and the cold reality. Imagine the king in his final war room, a rough-hewn chamber in the citadel of Panticapaeum. It is less a palace and more a military camp, smelling of fur, raw leather, and the sour taste of fermented mare's milk from his Sarmatian allies. Mithridates is no longer focused on defense. He is consumed by his final grand strategic offensive. He spends his days poring over crude maps, tracing the path across the Danube and through the formidable mountain ranges of the Balkans. His plan, though spectacular, was financially ruinous and militarily reckless. It required years of preparation, massive debt, and, crucially, the unquestioning endurance of his remaining subjects, the common people of the Bosporan kingdom. Mostly Greek colonists and allied tribes were exhausted. They had paid taxes and supplied men for 25 years of endless war against Rome. They were not inspired by the dream of conquering Italy. They were terrified by the certainty that Mithridates' recklessness would bring the legions of Pompey to their frozen shores. The son, Pharnacus, leader of the opposition, was not a Roman general or a disgruntled noble. It was the king's own son and intended heir, Pharnacus II. Pharnacus was a prince of the new generation. He had grown up on the periphery of the war, focused more on the stable commerce of the Black Sea than the grandiose doomed politics of his father. He was soft where his father was hard, practical where his father was visionary, and terrified of Rome where his father was defiant. Imagine Pharnacus observing his father. He sees not the legendary poison king, but an old, obsessive tyrant clinging to a fantasy that threatened to destroy the last remnant of their dynasty. He watched as his father demanded impossible levies of money and men, stripping the kingdom bare for a march into the unknown. Pharnacus had a simple, compelling fear. If he waited for his father's final invasion attempt, Pompey would sail north and destroy them all. If he acted now, surrendered to Rome, and offered his father as a prize, he might save his kingdom and secure Roman recognition for his own rule. The choice for Pharnacus was between filial piety to a dead dream and survival for his kingdom. He chose survival. The plot, the toxin of discontent, the betrayal was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping psychological poison, meticulously applied. Pharnacus began by subtly cultivating the existing dissent. He met in secret with the officers and noblemen who were most opposed to the invasion plan, the men who had watched their peers freeze or starve in the Caucasus. He did not ask them to commit treason immediately. Instead, he presented them with a simple logical truth. The king has lost his mind. We must save him from himself, and save the kingdom from him. The turning point came when Mithridates ordered the execution of several highly respected officials who had dared to speak against the invasion. This act of paranoia, a reflex from his earlier life, shattered the final illusions of the court. The men understood, if they did not move against the king would soon move against them. The final siege, Pantacapone, climax occurred on a cold, desperate night in Panticipaeum. The revolt began not with a subtle poison, but with a loud, unavoidable military action, a siege from within. Pharnacus, having secured the allegiance of the Bosporan legions, ordered his men to besiege the citadel where Mithridates and his few loyalists were barricaded. Imagine the king, old but still sharp, watching from the battlements. He sees his own banner, the 8-pointed star of Pontus, being carried by the soldiers now commanded by his son. The sound of the siege is not the disciplined clamor of Roman engineering, but the angry, localized shouting of Pontic men led by his own blood. Mithridates tried to rally his men. He offered freedom, gold, and land. But the fear of the northern march was stronger than the promise of riches. His loyalists were few, his trusted Scythian guards, and a handful of Greek bodyguards. He realized the fortress of his body, protected by all his science, was surrounded by the fortress of his kingdom, now commanded by his traitorous son. The last resort. The poison fails as the siege intensified, and the king realized his fate was sealed. He performed his final, decisive act. He gathered his remaining family, his 2 daughters, who had remained fiercely loyal to him, and ordered their deaths, saving them from the inevitable capture and humiliation by the Romans. This was an act of ancient, tragic mercy. Then, Mithridates turned to his most trusted companion, his Mithridateum. He ground a lethal dose of the strongest, fastest-acting poison he possessed, likely highly concentrated hemlock or a potent mineral arsenic. He prepared the liquid himself, his hands, though aged, still moving with the precise, methodical movements of the master alchemist. He raised the cup to his lips and drank it down. Imagine the profound irony of the scene. The man who had spent 60 years making himself immune to death by poison, deliberately trying to end his life with his own failed creation. He waited for the cold numbness, the sudden fire, the swift collapse. But it did not come. His body, trained over decades by the daily ritual of the Mithridateum, was a biological fortress too strong even for his highest dose. The toxins, meant to kill instantly, were neutralized upon contact. He felt only a crushing, dizzying nausea, but the swift, final release of death was denied to him. The king had succeeded in his quest for biological immortality, but it condemned him to a slower, more brutal end. The final intervention, as the revolt outside the citadel walls intensified, and the shouts of the mutinous soldiers grew louder. Mithridates called for his last remaining loyal guard, a Gaulish mercenary named Mithridates. The king, dizzy, sickened but alive, staggered toward the soldier. He handed Mithridates his sword. In his final moments, Mithridates VI, the king who had defied Rome, addressed his guard not in Greek, the language of command, nor in Latin, the language of the enemy, but in the rough, familiar dialect of the Pontic highlands, the language of his youth in the wilderness. "I have done all I could to protect myself against the enemy," the king is reported to have whispered. "But I could not defend against my own son." He gave his final command. The death of a king must be swift and honorable. Mithridates, witnessing the failure of the world's most famous antidote and the king's absolute desperation, did not hesitate. He plunged the sword into the king's chest. Mithridates VI, Eupator Dionysus, the Poison King, the last great challenger to the Roman Republic, fell to the stone floor. He died not by the hand of Pompey, not by the plots of Rome, and not by the poison he had mastered, but by the sword of his last loyal guard. Ordered by his own desperate will, the legacy of the shadow, the death of Mithridates, was the true end of the Eastern Wars. Phinaxus immediately sent his father's body to Pompey, hoping to win favor. Pompey, though he had pursued the king for years, treated the body with the deep respect one gives a truly worthy enemy. He buried Mithridates with royal honors, recognizing that only such a formidable figure could have so successfully delayed and humiliated Rome for a generation. The king's death marked the end of independent Pontus and the formal annexation of all Asia Minor by the Roman Republic. Rome was victorious, but the legacy of the Poison King persisted. The recipe for the Mithridateum was recovered from his notes. Roman physicians, fascinated and appalled by its complexity, adopted it and refined it. The antidote, the Mithridateum, would remain in the medical pharmacopoeia of Europe for centuries, a silent, enduring testament to the brilliant, paranoid king who created it in the dark recesses of the Pontic Mountains. His life was a paradox, a man who sought to conquer the entire world, but whose final, most significant conquest was the chemistry of his own blood. He failed to defeat Rome, but he succeeded in cheating his own poison. The shadow of the Pontic Mountains, the mountains that had sheltered and forged him, finally claimed him. Let the memory of the long war, the complex poisons, and the inevitable betrayal fade now. Rest in the quiet certainty that even the most dangerous king must find his final long-sought peace. Let us now linger on the final, profound stillness that fell upon the war-torn city of Panticapaeum. The loud, brutal drama of the siege has ended. The shouts of the mutinous soldiers have dissolved into the quiet, frozen air of the Bosporus. In the silent chamber of the citadel, the great King Mithridates VI, the man who consumed poison every morning, lay dead, not by the toxin he mastered, but by the clean, final thrust of a mercenary's sword. The ultimate paradox of his life was complete. He had conquered the most insidious threat to ancient power, the secret weapon of the assassin, only to be defeated by the most common betrayal. His failure to die by poison was the final defining irony of his existence. He had achieved biological immortality, only to be denied a quick, dignified end by his own genius. The silence after the sword. Imagine the immediate aftermath. Pharnacus II, the victorious but deeply conflicted son, entered the chamber. The sight must have been chilling. The legendary king, the man who had faced down Sulla and evaded Pompey, reduced to a corpse on a stone floor. The smell in the room was not of blood, but of the strange, acrid mix of medicinal herbs and distilled minerals, the scent of the failed Mithridates. Pharnacus felt no love, perhaps only a profound relief and a crushing cold fear of the consequences. His first priority was to prove his loyalty to Rome and confirm his father's death to the world. The king's body was quickly, carefully prepared. The sword was removed, and the body was wrapped in royal linen and placed in a lavish though hasty coffin. This was the final, necessary political maneuver, the surrender of the greatest prize. The coffin was loaded onto a swift galley and dispatched across the Black Sea, a long, quiet voyage back toward the heart of the world. Mithridates had spent his life trying to destroy the Roman audience, Pompey's respect. The news of the king's death reached Pompey the Great in the city of Amisus, a city Mithridates had once called his own. Pompey, who had hunted the poison king across the mountains and the seas for years, received the message with a silence that spoke volumes. The body arrived, escorted by Pharnacus' nervous, obsequious envoys. They presented the king's remains to Pompey, seeking immediate favor and recognition. Imagine Pompey's reaction. He refused to look at the face of his defeated enemy. This refusal was not born of squeamishness, but of profound, strategic respect. Pompey understood that viewing the corpse would diminish the legend. Mithridates, alive and defiant, had been a political force of nature, a terrifying shadow on the eastern horizon. Seeing his lifeless body would reduce him to a mere man, and Pompey needed the memory of the formidable king to justify the immense cost and glory of his own victory. Pompey ordered that the body be treated with the utmost reverence. He organized a burial with full royal honors, a final magnificent ceremony befitting an antagonist of his own scale. The king of Pontus was laid to rest in Sinope, the very city he had fled in his youth and reclaimed in his adulthood. In death, Mithridates VI received the honor of a king of kings, granted by the very enemy he had sought to destroy. The war was over, sealed by a grand, silent gesture of recognition. The true legacy, the apothecary's treasure while the political dust settled. The true lasting legacy of the Poison King began its quiet journey westward. Among the vast spoils of war seized by Pompey's legions, the gold, the statues, the jewels, and the military standards was a collection of documents, deemed worthless by the average Roman soldier, but priceless to a few scholars. Mithridates' personal scrolls and wax tablets. These were the king's life work, the meticulous toxicological library, the notes on his experiments, and crucially, the finalized recipe for the Mithridates atium. Imagine these scrolls, written in the king's own hand, smelling faintly of sulfur and dried herbs, carried from the cold of the Bosporus to the warm libraries of Rome. They were not merely a list of ingredients. They were the accumulated medical knowledge of the ancient world, synthesized by a paranoid genius. The scrolls immediately fascinated the most brilliant Roman scholars. The recipe was seized upon by Aulus Cornelius Celsus, a famous medical writer, and later by Galen, the most influential physician of the Roman Empire. The medical immortality of the formula. This is the ultimate, quiet victory of the king, the final supreme irony, the Mithridates. The toxicological shield created to defy Rome became Rome's most celebrated medical formula. Galen's refinement. Galen simplified the original Mithridates, making it accessible to practitioners. He publicly endorsed its use not just as an antidote to poison, but as a general tonic and panacea, a universal remedy against fever, plague, and internal illness. The long reign, for over 1,500 years, the Mithridatism, or its later modification, Theriac, was the most famous and widely prescribed drug in the Western world. Used from Rome to medieval Europe and into the Renaissance, apothecaries across Europe kept sealed jars of the complex paste. The name of the Poison King lived on, silently, in every medicinal compound prescribed against death and disease. Every dose taken was a tribute to the paranoid genius who invented it, Mithridates VI, Eupator Dionysus. The great enemy of the Republic failed to achieve political immortality. But he achieved something far more subtle and enduring: medical immortality. His contribution to chemistry and pharmacology outlived the Republic he hated and the empire that succeeded it. The final drop of irony, his life, therefore, stands as a monument to the ultimate failure of control. He controlled the land, yet he died fleeing through it. He controlled his kingdom, yet he was betrayed by his own family. He controlled his body, meticulously making it immune to every known substance. Yet, in that final, necessary moment of defeat, the very mastery he achieved became his undoing. The final drop of poison, designed to deliver instantaneous, painless death, was neutralized by the decades of careful discipline. The fortress of his body held too strongly, forcing him to beg a loyal servant for the release he could not grant himself. The irony of the final drop is this: Mithridates conquered death, only to be conquered by life. He conquered the pharmacon, poison cure, but he failed to conquer the most dangerous, human toxin, the cold calculus of self-interest. His story closes not with the roar of battle or the fanfare of victory, but with the quiet sound of a physician grinding herbs in a mortar, preparing the remedy that was born from an act of patricide, and co-preparing the remedy that was born from an act of patricide, and was born from an act of patricide, and perfected by a lifetime of paranoia. Let your mind rest now on the knowledge that even the most terrifying figures of history leave behind legacies that are often complex, quiet, and profoundly, ironically human. The Poison King is finally at peace.